WGN for about seven years now, and he has just turned out to be a huge champion for this project and a really good friend. So, Sean, come on.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. There we go. See? I take a cue from Father Flagger, who says it, keeps on saying it until someone responds. Good afternoon to you all. Beautiful day. I asked Tom for this, and he said, sure, why not? As you know, Tom is the sponsor for the Sally Ride plaque that will be dedicated this year, and he's excited about that. Unfortunately, he had a different prior commitment that he couldn't come. But I want to introduce to you our two panelists today. If you could step in here. Lillian Faderman, Dr. Lillian Faderman is Professor Emerita from Fresno State, two of the foremost minds on LGBTQ history, as well as Malcolm Lazin, the Executive Director of the Equality Forum in Fresno, California. Welcome to both of you. Welcome. What did I say?
Fresno.
Did I say? I was looking at her. Philadelphia, Fresno. Two F sounds, you know. Please, I'm pretty. I read the words off the screen. So it's interesting, and I love history, and I love being able to pass on knowledge. And from the moment that I heard about the Legacy Project, it was an idea that I knew needed to happen. Way back when I was a senior in college, I took my introduction to lesbian and gay history. And that's my introduction to my community. And that's where I learned a lot about where we came from. And then I realized that unless you took that specific class, you didn't know that. And the culture that we had beyond our own family, we just never got to pick up on unless we had another family member around us who was in the LGBTQ community who could pass along some of that knowledge. So that is why the Legacy Project is here, and we're so happy, Malcolm and Lillian, that you could join us today. Why don't we start out with you? I'll let you hold the microphone, and we'll turn it on for you. And remember to hold it really close. Tell me, and this will be for you as well, Malcolm, why do you think it is that the LGBTQ community for so many years has had to deal with a prejudice in the past, and in that same vein, because history does inform the present, what can we learn from the LGBT pioneers from 50, 60 years ago and beyond?
I've just finished the manuscript to a huge book on LGBT history beginning in 1948 and ending in the present. And the distance that we've traveled has been so remarkable. And what I fear is that young people in particular will forget that distance, will forget how far we've come, how terrible things used to be. I begin in 1948, as I said, with the case of a university professor at the University of Missouri who was much loved, very successful. He was in line for the deanship. The man that he lived with was arrested and made to name names, and of course he named the professor. Not only was the professor's career destroyed, but that was the beginning of a huge witch hunt at the University of Missouri that destroyed many other professors' careers as well as many students. And that was happening all over the country in the 1940s, in the 1950s, even in the 1960s. I so fear that young people will forget how much of a battle we've had for virtually 70 years to get where we are today. And that's one of the reasons I'm so happy for the Legacy Project, because I was walking on Halstead just yesterday, and I stopped to read every single plaque, and I imagined what it must be like for a young person to see that, to read those plaques, to have access to that kind of history, to know something of where we came from, to know who our heroes are. So I think it's absolutely crucial that we keep remembering what our past was like, how far we've traveled, and who we have to thank for where we are today.
All right. Lillian, thank you very much. Malcolm, same question for you. When we talk about where we're going, how much does history affect that?
Well, let me first start off by really extending my gratitude to Victor and to the Legacy Project for what it is that you're doing. I think something that is really important and bears repeating frequently is that we are the only minority community worldwide that's not taught its history at home, in public school, or in religious institution. And think about what a profound impact that has on all of us. So, we have, in fact, the affirmative obligation to provide that information. And so I really want to commend all of you in terms of, what you're doing. I'm particularly, pleased to be here in Chicago, which is the home of the very first gay organization in this country, started by Henry Gerber in 1924. This is where, and I see Tracy here, but this is where the very first gay publication in this country was produced. And so it's a particular honor to be in Chicago. In terms of our history, yes, it absolutely informs us in terms of the present. As you may know, in my home city of Philadelphia is where the annual reminders occurred. They were put together by Frank Kameny and Barbara Giddings. It was in 1965, on July 4th, that activists from New York and Philly and Washington came together for the very first time, identified themselves as being gay, and outside of Independence Hall, when the Liberty Bell was directly inside the front door, they asked for equality. 40 people showed up. It was, in terms of that moment in time, the largest gathering of gay people in the history of the world to be out and asking for equality. And every year, every July 4th, they had an annual reminder. And those annual reminders ended in 1965, and they paved the way for the Stonewall riot. And Barbara and Frank and the other organizers recognized that the Boston Tea Party had just occurred, and instead of having an annual reminder, they put all their energies into organizing a first annual remembrance of Stonewall. And today we remember that as the first New York Pride Parade. So I take particular pride in coming from Philadelphia, because it's not only the birthplace of our nation, but it is also the birthplace of our movement.
All right, you can keep the microphone there. You hit on some of this, Malcolm, and you did a wonderful job of this. Tell us what moments in history, what movements, what individuals do you think have had the most profound impact on our community in the last half of the 20th century and the early part here of the 21st century? And what has kept our community from knowing those things as a whole?
Well, certainly from my viewpoint, the father and mother of the LGBT civil rights movement are Frank Kameny and Barbara Giddings, hands down. They did remarkable things. Just think about it. When they stepped forward on July 4th of 1965, our federal government would not employ an openly gay or lesbian person. So if you couldn't be employed by your own federal government, you can imagine what your employment opportunities were in the private sector. The American Psychiatric Association declared us per se mentally ill. Can you imagine starting a civil rights movement with the rest of the country thinking you're a Looney Tune? It was also at a moment in time when all of our states made it a crime for people of the same sex to engage in sexual intimacy in the privacy of their home, which meant that any citizen who wanted to dime you, wanted to cause you a problem, you were committing a crime. The police could knock down your front door. They could go into your bedroom and they could arrest you. Okay? So, you know, that was a truism. And lastly, almost all of our states made it a crime for more than one homosexual to be in a bar. In New York, it was a crime for more than one homosexual to be in a bar, and those bars that existed, Stonewall being one of them, were owned by the mafia. The drinks were twice the price of even the most expensive straight bars in New York, and the money went to pay off the police. So, you know, this was a moment in time when, no, there was not an internet. You couldn't hook up that way. And so, you know, if you now start to take a look at the implications of all of that, you can learn how history can inform the present, because only 2 years ago did we see the last remnants of the discrimination against gays and lesbians in federal employment with the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Dr. Faderman, when we're talking about this, and Malcolm did a wonderful job hitting on these points, tell me, in the last 15 years, we have seen the LGBT community come out almost as a whole, and it's really changed. The community has changed in the last 15, 20 years. Tell me what you think in those 20 years really propelled the movement, and who inspires you the most?
I won't be simplistic the way our wonderful vice president was and say that Will and Grace changed everything. But it did change a lot. I think the media has a lot to do with changed attitudes. But the media wouldn't have been where it is now if it hadn't been for 70 years of LGBT activism, 70 years of pushing the media to change. Just one example I'll give you of where the media used to be. Homosexuality was literally the love that dare not speak its name in the past. There was a play on Broadway by Lillian Faderman called The Children's Hour in the 1930s, and Hollywood bought it for a film. They couldn't even use the title for the film in the 1930s. They ended up calling it These Three. It was a play about two women school teachers, one who's in love with the other. The other one is ostensibly heterosexual and has a fiancé. So Hollywood called it, instead of The Children's Hour, These Three, and made it into a heterosexual triangle instead of a lesbian love affair that could never get off the ground, which was what the play was really about. We were, since Will Hayes, the man who was in charge of Hollywood censorship in the early 1930s, we were never mentioned in the movies. Hayes is said to have said, "I never want to hear the word pansy unless somebody's holding a flower." So not even in a negative way were we mentioned in the movies. There was simply no acknowledgement that homosexuality existed. No acknowledgement whatsoever on television until the 1970s, and that acknowledgement was awful. There was, for instance,
Billy Crystal and Soap?
No, I'm thinking of Marcus Welby, MD, this just absolutely awful program on Marcus Welby of a high school teacher who molests a 14-year-old. But that was the beginning of great things for us, because the National Gay Task Force began protesting, began insisting that these images have to change, and slowly they did have to change. They culminated with Will and Grace, and of course Ellen, that kiss that was seen around the world, and now some incredible shows about us, such as Glee and Modern Family. Do you know what Ann Romney's favorite television series is? Modern Family. I hope she saw the show where, what are the two men? The Mitchell and Cameron, where they marry. So that sort of thing has certainly changed public opinion. And then I think we're very fortunate in our president, who's finally evolved. But even before he evolved, he was doing wonderful things. He signed a gender-inclusive hate crimes bill in 2009. He helped us get rid of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He signed an executive order that's not as good as ENDA, but at least it takes care of many employees who are gay and lesbian and transgender and bisexual and who are working for federal contractors. So I think it's 70 years of hard work that's finally taken effect that has made a huge difference.
Malcolm, was it Stonewall? Was it Will and Grace? Was it Ellen doing that kiss? Was it the President of the United States, a sitting president, finally saying, this is what our country's priority is? What was the one defining moment for our community?
Let me give you three, and I'll give you three very quickly. One was coming out, and as tragic as the AIDS epidemic was, the reality is it was, when we as a community realized that if we did not stand up for ourselves, no one else would. And so it really was a game changer for us. Two, I agree, in terms of media, where people, instead of seeing stereotypes, all of a sudden we're seeing a wide variety of folks who are LGBT. And lastly, something that I don't think is really recognized or appreciated. In terms of the two major prior civil rights movements, in terms of African Americans and in terms of women, as they were starting to be given their equality, because they had been so oppressed, it took really a generation until they were in a position to take on the type of leadership mantle in our corporations, that we're now seeing. So from 65 to 85, you saw the remarkable change. In terms of us, and I think this is the big difference, no one ever interfered with my ability to get an education because of being gay, and I doubt you as well. So by the time that we became empowered, we were in positions of leadership. We were in the media. We were in executive suites. Okay? We were in positions where we could help to propel this movement. It may be because we were political fundraisers. It may be because we were elected officials. And I think that's what's helped to propel this movement as well.
I just want to add one thing to something that Malcolm essentially said, the importance of coming out. Our martyred hero, Harvey Milk, said it really well in the 1970s, how absolutely crucial that was. He said, come out wherever you are. And that's what we've been doing, and that has made all the difference in the world, that our fellow American citizens see how diverse we are. And I think that that's made a difference in general acceptance. It's made a huge difference in terms of families. It's a little hard to hate LGBT people if someone that you love, someone who's so close to you, is one of that community. So yes, that's been absolutely crucial.
One thing that you can keep the microphone. One thing that the Legacy Project is all about is to pass along the history and the knowledge to the next generation. As someone who devoted her life to education, where do you see the biggest impact happening, and how do we get the attention of the 20-somethings, the teens, walking down Halsted and passing by these expensive and very colorful bronze plaques that have lots of words and lots of history, and not be looking down on their cell phones the entire time and actually notice what's going on?
In my home state, California, we've done something really wonderful. We have a terrific governor who has helped us do that, and that is that LGBT history is mandated to be taught in the public schools, and I would hope that that's going to be all over the country. Maybe not in the South, but certainly in big cities like Chicago and such. So I think that that's crucial. I think that the public schools have to help us. And it seems to me that there's sympathy for that in some places. The last time I was in Chicago was about 14 months ago. It was an in-service, not in Chicago itself. I was in the Champaign-Urbana area, but it was an in-service for K through 12 teachers who wanted to incorporate LGBT material in their teaching plans. So it is happening. It just needs to be happening on a large scale, and I hope that will occur in the not too distant future. But let me just say too how vital I think it is for young people to know that history. I came out before most of you were born, probably. I came out into the bar culture. It was a gay girls' bar, as we used to call it those days, in Los Angeles. And I remember the second night I was there were a bunch of lesbians, gay girls, who were dressed in black, and they told me that they had just been at a funeral for a young woman who used to be a habitué of the Open Door, the bar was called, who committed suicide. Her family rejected her. I had a dear friend from the time I was 16 to the time I was 24, a gay boy who killed himself. He was orphaned. He had no sense that there was any hope for him in the world. He had no sense of his own dignity. And am I saying that knowing about our past would give him a sense of dignity? Maybe so. You know, to know that people like Walt Whitman or Bayard Rustin or Frank Kameny or Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci or Oscar Wilde had something in common with us can surely give a young person a sense of pride. And so I think the Legacy Project is crucial. I think teachers need to take their students up and down Halsted and do teaching units on the project, and I think it needs a lot more publicity than it's gotten so far, and I'm hoping that will happen and that it will proliferate all over the country. It must be incredible for a young LGBT person to walk down the street and see all of these wonderful bronze plaques about the people who came before us.
Malcolm, one thing that I wanted to ask you about, I am at the top of my generation, and then we have 20 years later the youngest of my generation who's now in college. When she was here for spring break, I took her down Halsted, and she read every single one of those plaques. And she's straight, but obviously very open to many different people, and very her mind is on diversity just because of her generation. One thing that she said was, why do we need to, this is great, but why do we need to know this? Because it seems like, you know, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered people are doing all right these days.
Well, I wish we were doing as all right as she thinks we're doing, and obviously she's part of a generation that, you know, is seeing remarkable changes. But, you know, the reality is that, you know, by knowing our history, we really send a powerful message to young people who are struggling with their sexual identity. We need to be providing them with role models. When we let people know about our history, we make an important civil rights statement, which is we also make important national and international contributions. You know, when we talk about Harvey Milk, absolutely an incredible narrative. But you know what? Harvey Milk is one of at least 100 other equally as powerful narratives that we need to be getting out to our community. Because, you know, we're at a very interesting moment in time. Thank goodness we're winning the same-sex marriage equality fight, and likely, and possibly I should say, in June of next year the Supreme Court will issue a decision. But, you know, the game is not over even if we win same-sex marriage. Really what we now need to be doing is really engaged in community building. And there is nothing more powerful in terms of community building than teaching our history and teaching our narratives. Let me give you one very short example from the annual reminders. So here are activists from New York and Philly and Washington who are deciding on where do they want to hold the very first of the demonstrations. New Yorkers would, of course, say it's the largest city. Washington, of course, would say it's the nation's capital. And Philadelphia had the smallest number of people. And yes, it's nice, it's Independence Hall. And yes, it's nice, it's July 4th, but that's not a game winner. So when you opened the door back in 1965 of Independence Hall every morning, you saw the Liberty Bell. And what was the organizers were reminded of is as follows. That was a cracked bell. It was fixed and it cracked again on the 3rd anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And it was put into an attic, and it would otherwise have been forgotten except for the following. It had an inscription on it from Leviticus that said, "Proclaim liberty to all the inhabitants thereof." And the abolitionists, looking for a logo, remembered the Liberty Bell, and they used it. 50 years later, the suffragettes, wanting to win the women's right to vote, remembered the abolitionists and the Liberty Bell, and they used it. And 50 years later, when our fathers and mothers of this movement were looking for where is the right place to start this civil rights movement, they reminded the folks from New York and Washington of the Liberty Bell and how we are linked to the most basic of all promises of this country: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and equality.
Malcolm, it's interesting that you bring up the Bible, Leviticus, for the inscription on the Liberty Bell, because it almost plays into my next question. And as we go to this question with the good doctor, think of some questions that you may have yourselves, and we'll go to you in just a moment. But it was reported in the Huffington Post, and I'm sure Tracy knows about this. I just talked with our cardinal here, Cardinal Francis George, this last week about a situation that was going on with one of the music directors in a suburban church. He was fired after he got engaged to his longtime partner. In the Huffington Post on Friday came out that, and this is the headline, I just want to read it to you so I don't get it wrong. Cardinal Francis George says Catholics are forced to live under pro-gay state religion akin to Sharia law. This is a man that I've talked to many times. I don't know if he knows that I'm gay or not, or I'm the chapter president for the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association, but he's always been downright nice to me. So let me ask you, we're talking about passing along the LGBTQ history to our younger folks. How important is it to make sure that those who are maybe at the end of our life careers also need to be brought on board with the contributions that our community has given the world?
You mean the elderly?
We'll say the elderly. I know a lot of people don't like the elderly. That's why I say at the end of our life career.
I have great hope for even the elderly. I'm almost there myself. I think that the older generation is being brought along. What I'm more worried about are the churches, or some churches, I should say. I was very troubled, for instance, by a recent story in Ohio of a woman who had worked for 19 years in a Catholic school, who was much loved, a PE teacher, whose mother died. And there was an obituary for the mother, and those who survived the mother were included. So the dead woman's son was included, and in parenthesis, the name of his wife. And the teacher was included, and in parenthesis, the name of the woman that she had lived with for the last 10 years. One of the teacher's students came home and innocently said to her mother, please pray for my teacher's mother that I love so much. And the parents said, well, let's look the obituary up, and they did, and she saw that in the parenthesis it was a woman's name, and she immediately wrote to the head of the diocese, the bishop, saying, I do not want my child taught by a lesbian, and Catholic children should not be taught by a lesbian. This was a woman who had been so successful in the classroom with her students for 19 years. Students protested, the community protested, the diocese fired her anyway. And I know of many stories like that. So the church has been a real problem. But having said that, I have to say, too, that there are pockets. Things here and there seem to be coming around. I'm very encouraged, for instance, by some things that the Pope has said, which is certainly a huge improvement over his predecessors. Within the Mormon Church, the Mormons were very active in passing Proposition 8 in California, which was the proposition that took same-sex marriage away from us for a while. Within the Mormon Church, there's now a significant movement of acceptance of LGBT people. And I was thrilled in the Pride parades in San Diego that we've attended recently to see a big Mormon contingent with signs that say, sorry, we're so late. There's a group of Mormons that are pro-LGBT. So it's happening slowly, I hope. But it seems to me that that's an even harder hurdle to jump than the generational problem. I think older people are coming around as well. Maybe it's because they watch Modern Love or they've watched Will and Grace.
Good old Modern Family action. Who has a question? We have two wonderful minds here, lots of knowledge. Don't everyone jump at once. You must have something on your mind. I didn't cover everything. Yes, sir. You get to talk into the microphone.
I was just curious about, do you think that the role of independent LGBT media and film festivals played a role in changing media imagery and affecting our movement?
Who wants to take that one up? Lillian? All right.
I think it has to some extent, particularly because it's shown that there's an audience for that material. And of course, the audience initially was LGBT people, but it's become a crossover audience. I hope those festivals continue. I hope that the mainstream doesn't drive them out of business. But we have in San Diego, where I live during the summers, two wonderful independent theaters. And I love to watch the previews of the coming attractions. I don't think there's a single film out nowadays that doesn't have at least a minor lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender character. We are in at least an independent film. It's absolutely fascinating to see the way the media has changed and is open to us.
My 27-year-old cousin just moved from Minneapolis to LA to start his film career, and he wants to be a director, and he called me up a couple of weeks ago and goes, dude, straight guy, frat dude, he goes, dude, how do I do a gay movie? He's been in LA for 2 months. I really wasn't sure what he was getting at. One more question. We have time for one more question. Yes.
So I'd like to know who inspired you to come out and do your work. Who was the person for you that meant that you were going to aspire to do what you do?
This is a fairly easy one, right? Right?
For me, it wasn't a single person, actually. it was a movement, and it's a movement that's almost forgotten nowadays. It was the lesbian feminist movement of the 70s, and it was realizing that there are people who want to hear about lesbian history, which is where I began. I began with lesbian history, and understanding that finally there was an audience for this. I'd wanted to write about lesbian history for many years, but thought that nobody would want to read it. And suddenly in the early 1970s, this group popped up to encourage me to write to them. I've since expanded the book that I published in 2006, for instance, I did with a gay male historian. It's called Gay LA. It's a history of the gay and lesbian and transgender movements in Los Angeles. And my present book deals with the history of LGBT people, as I said, from 1948. But the initial impulse was the realization in the 1970s that finally there was a readership. Finally, people would be interested in hearing this story.
It was all those gay girls. And who doesn't like a happy girl? We can all agree on that. Malcolm, who's your hero?
Well, so to sort of answer that question, and I'll get to it very briefly, which is I'm the executive producer of 3 award-winning documentary films. One, Gay Pioneers, which we co-produced with PBS about the Annual Reminders. The second, I'm very proud, was screened here in Chicago, called Saint of 9/11, story of Father Michael Judge, chaplain of the Fire Department of New York, and obviously we're delighted that he is going to be recognized in terms of the Legacy Project. But the third was called Jim in Bold, and it was the really first major documentary about bullying. So the person who, I always remember is Jimmy Wheeler. And so Jimmy was a gay teen, and he was bullied. He was extraordinarily bright. He was truly a brilliant young poet and artist. And because of the bullying, he ended up taking his life. I learned about it. 5 years later, we ended up making this film about Jimmy. And Jimmy's family became involved. Actually, it was a process for them of coming out, because when this film was made, it was at a moment in time when teens took their lives, their secrets were buried with them, and so Jimmy's folks and family wanted to make something of the loss of his life. But I got interested in Jimmy because I had read his poetry, and there was, one was called Timeline of a Faggot, and I asked his sister about that poem, and she said, "Oh yes, I know it well." He wrote it shortly after he was surrounded in his high school locker room and urinated on. And so Jimmy, no matter how much other people thought he was wonderful, always, was shaped by what his male peer group was saying to him, and he could never escape it. So, in one sense, maybe Jimmy took his life, and maybe in another sense, homophobia murdered him. And so Jimmy Wheeler is my inspiration.
That's all the time we have. Dr. Lillian Faderman, thank you very much for joining us. Give her a round of applause. And Malcolm Lazin from the Equality Forum, thank you very much. Thank you very much.